Oh hi, welcome to Aquatazoo, where we like to nerd out over all things zoo and aquarium related. I'm l.semple, and today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about surplus animals. It is just like what it sounds. It's when a zoo or aquarium has more animals than they intended or than they want to take care of long term, and it's not necessarily a problem. We just have to find a good place for those animals to go. I've talked about where our animals come from, but I realized when someone asked me this question not long ago that I had never talked about specifically what happens when we have too many. It's not something that we deal with a whole lot, I'll be honest, or it's not something that we don't plan for, I would say. Like we usually have a plan for this kind of stuff. So this is what we do when we have a couple of animals that we don't really need long term, like they don't have a good space or a good task to do within the zoo or aquarium. Like, some animals have the quote unquote job of being exhibit animals. Some of them can be ambassador animals, which means they maybe interact with the public or go out and outreach and visit schools and things like that. If we don't have a task for an animal, or we're not trying to breed them or something like that, if they don't have a purpose that makes sense for that animal, then we will try to surplus that animal. Surplusing an animal takes many forms. There's lots of ways that we rehome an animal if needed. And again, part of responsible exhibit planning, responsible population planning is having a plan for the entire life of an animal. So if you're going to end up breeding animals because they're part of a breeding program or something like that, then it's understood that we're going to have surplus animals here because our animals are going to reproduce. There may be other zoos, aquariums, and other institutions that may be waiting for those animals to be, born and produced, and then they can continue on the breeding program at their facility. There's that sort of thing. There are some animals that we have that just tend to reproduce because that's what they naturally do, and they're in high demand, so it's not usually a problem to find another home for them. Moon jellies tend to be a very good example of this. A lot of facilities tend to breed or reproduce, or we call it propagate, lots of moon jellies because lots of zoos and aquariums house moon jellies. They are a very common animal that are relatively easy to transport, and people love seeing them, and they're usually just in demand, right? They are easy to find takers for because everybody's always looking for them, especially aquariums, obviously. But lots of us have moon jellies, lots of us exhibit moon jellies. Not all of us have the setup to have them reproducing on site because that does take a lot of time and effort and space, but we depend on the other facilities that do that kind of thing. Like, there will never be a point where we have too many moon jellies and nobody has any room to house them. It's just one of those things. We don't have to take any from the wild necessarily, unless it's just to kind of replenish the genetics in our systems with the broodstock that we have. But it keeps the exhibits filled without there being a lot of quote unquote extras that can't be housed somewhere, right? Everybody's always looking for them. But we plan our populations, our exhibit collections and things with this in mind. We know that animals naturally want to reproduce. These are all natural behaviors, and if we can accommodate that, we will. And then we will plan accordingly for any offspring that might be produced and prepare ourselves and other facilities for what may become surplus animals. I mean, ultimately the goal here is to have animals exhibiting natural behaviors so that people can see and learn, right? And then we want there to be animals in zoo and aquarium populations, right? But we don't necessarily want to take them from the wild. So good planning, good exhibit design, all of these things that we strive to do to make sure that the animal feels comfortable, that they can still exhibit all of their natural behaviors, that they have everything that they need to live a full, healthy life, even if they are not living with wild populations, right? all of that stuff we do so that they feel so comfortable, they just do their natural thing, which is including reproducing, right? And we don't want to impact those wild populations because they need to stay wild. We want them to survive out there as long as they can. So what we end up doing is just allowing the animals to do, and encouraging the animals to do their natural thing and live as naturally as they can. And it often results in some new baby animals. Not necessarily all animals born at a zoo or aquarium are going to be surplus animals, right? We do have to kind of figure out what we can do, how we're going to house the animals, and kind of evaluating the genetics is a really important piece. So if we've got animals that are reproducing and reproducing and reproducing, that's great for them. I'm so glad that they're comfortable and doing their thing like they would in the wild. But now we've got lots of offspring to deal with, and also very similar genetics of those offspring, right? So there's a lot of science that goes into genetics when it comes to zoo and aquarium populations, and we try to move animals around so that we can preserve the genetic diversity of the animals so they don't all end up, related to each other and inbred and that kind of stuff, right? So we try to be really responsible, knowing who's the parent of whom and how they got here. We're going to move them over there so that the genetics stay as varied and diverse as we can. So when we have a surplus animal, we often send that animal to another zoo or aquarium. Like I said, we want to maintain that wild population in the wild. Like, we don't want to have a huge impact there. That's not a part of our work, what we're doing, We don't want to pillage the jungles for all the animals, right? If we get a couple, that's cool. And if we can get them to feel comfortable enough to breed, even cooler. And then we can just distribute out their offspring from there to other zoos and aquariums who can perfect what's going on, who can study, who can, just benefit from having those animals in their collections and, exposing their communities to this really cool animal that's kind of rare, right? It's not just because it's rare that it's cool, but it's interesting to be able to offer a opportunity, I guess, to see, observe, learn. And then we also, as I've mentioned in past episodes, we also learn from the animals scientifically. It contributes to scientific research, behavior science, and that also benefits the wild populations. Because if we notice that certain behaviors are required as part of, breeding behavior, and say a wild population doesn't have the space to accomplish that anymore, but we've observed it in our facility with our animals in zoos and aquariums, we have some data to go with to fight for those animals and fight for preservation of their habitat and things like that. So we do learn things from the animals in zoos and aquariums that do benefit the wild populations. So anytime that we can figure out how to take care of an animal to the point that they feel comfortable enough to breed is always really cool, right? It can mean a lot of things, and it can mean a lot of beneficial things to the animals themselves as well as to the animals, their counterparts in the wild. I'm not trying to erase history here. I know that there are zoos and aquariums that have had animals that were, kind of pillaged from the wild, and it was repeatedly done, and there was inbreeding and all of this other kind of stuff. I do understand that that's part of zoo and aquarium history. It is unfortunate. And I'm not trying to downplay that. It definitely has happened. It happened in the past. We are moving away from that at this point wherever we can. And so despite that happening, I'm not trying to sugarcoat it and say that we're good and perfect. We have mishandled as an industry. We have in our past mishandled animals and mishandled wild populations. I'm not trying to deny that, but we're trying to do way, way better now. We're trying to benefit the animals in our collections as well as the animals in the wild, those wild populations. Those are really, really important in the end at this point. Modern zoos and aquariums are working towards preserving those wild populations as much as we can. It's a challenging world out there. We're making it worse. So if we can preserve those wild populations by learning from the populations that we have in our facilities, then we are going to do it. Anyway, back to surplus animals. There are lots of ways that we keep in touch with each other, we being zoos and aquariums, to keep everybody up to date about what we're up to, about animals that we may have available for surplus, animals that we will soon have available for surplus, and that sort of thing. There are different methods that we do that. We can post on listservs, we can communicate directly. We usually have an idea of what our fellow institutions have, and we kind of communicate based on that. Like if more than one facility has tigers, for example, they're going to kind of connect and talk about tigers. Listen, they're cool animals. They do cool things. Everybody wants to talk about everybody's, enrichment ideas and stuff like that. We're really collaborative these days. It was not always that way in the past, right? We used to compete. Zoos and aquariums used to compete because we're all kind of, dealing with the same kind of clientele. Like success meant you were selling tickets at the gate, right? But these days we're much more collaborative. If we find a way that is like revolutionary in the care of animals, we're going to share that because we want all of the animals in everyone's care to benefit from that knowledge, right? So this is a really collaborative process at this point, and we do try to keep in touch with other facilities who have similar animals because we like to share ideas, we like to bounce ideas off of each other. And sometimes we like to even trade like enrichment items and stuff like that might help another facility out. Maybe my animal is no longer interested in this thing anymore, but yours might really be interested in it. So rather than having it collecting dust on a shelf, here you go. Here's this cool enrichment experience that you can give to your animals that will be new for them, but ours got bored of it, right? That kind of stuff happens. So when we're talking about surplus animals, we have the ability to just keep everyone in the loop about what's going on as far as animals reproducing. And if we happen to, say, close an exhibit down and we no longer are housing this type of animal anymore, there are places where we know that that animal could probably go. We keep in touch about those kinds of things. I will say it's not perfect. We don't always know when animals are about to reproduce. Sometimes they'll surprise you. Birth control can fail and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of work that goes into reproduction and planning and exhibit design and space allocation and all this kind of stuff. Like this is our bread and butter of what we do in zoos and aquariums to make sure that we have the resources that we need to take really, really good care of these animals. And so we try to also make sure we understand what the future looks like and plan for that if we can. Obviously, stuff happens. We're not perfect, but we do our best. We try to plan for, here's what our population is now. If all goes well, what's our population going to look like in the future? If we have too many animals, where could they possibly go? Sometimes even before we receive animals that we intend to exhibit or have as a part of our collection, we're already contacting other facilities that have that type of animal or are willing to take any resulting offspring, right? We already have that plan kind of in place. We might even draw up contracts about that so that if there are animals that are produced as a result of this new pairing or new exhibit and we have animals that are extra, quote unquote, surplus animals, then we already know they're already going to go to this zoo and that aquarium. This place has dibs, like, the ancient right of dibs. But the animals are spoken for already. That way, we already have a plan. We know roughly how long we're going to try and keep an animal, like a newborn, if you will, that they will have a good chance to get past all those really early tough milestones that they might have to meet, and they're nice and stable before they go to their new home, their forever home with another zoo or aquarium, right? We try to stabilize everybody and get them in good shape, make sure they're well fed and all that kind of stuff before we transfer any animals out. We want to make sure transfer of animals is stressful. They have a hard time with it sometimes. Depends on the animal, depends on the transport, depends on the distance. But transports can be difficult, and so we want the animals in tip-top, healthy shape before they go on a trip to another zoo or aquarium. Yes, once they get there, they're good to go. Everything's fine, but we just want to make sure that they don't have any like crazy undue stress during that really difficult time. We can't explain to them what's going to happen, right? We can train them to be kind of ready for some of the aspects of it. Like you can get them used to kind of ambient noise, like they're traveling on a road, or you can get them used to being in a carrier and that sort of thing. So like their movement's a little bit restricted. Like you can train animals for some of it and build their resiliency for some of it, but still it's just a stressful process. And so we do a lot of preparation for that. So we're working with animals, we're training them, we're doing resiliency work to make sure that they're not too scared and not too panicked about what's happening when the time comes that they need to transfer to another zoo or aquarium. But we work together. We're trying to find good homes for all these places. We do vet the places that these animals are going to go to more than likely. If you are an AZA accredited facility, it's easy to then transport an animal to another AZA accredited facility because you have similar standards of care, right? If I have an animal at my facility that I want to make sure gets really good care, and I have a facility that's not AZA accredited that may want to take care of them, I'm going to have to do a little bit more investigation into that. Not that I can't transfer it to a non-AZA accredited facility, but those that are AZA accredited are keeping at the same level of high standards of care that my facility is at, right? So it won't be that jarring for the animal to go from really high standards to not so high standards of care, right? So it's not, and I'm not saying that AZA is the end-all pinnacle of everything as far as zoos and aquariums are concerned. It's not necessarily just because a facility is not AZA accredited does not mean it's a bad zoo or aquarium. But it's easy to tell if you are AZA accredited, you do have high standards of animal care because we hold each other at those high standards. So eventually when that transfer is made, we keep each other up to date about what's happening, like how's the animal doing? Is everything okay? Is there anything we can do? Oftentimes when you're dealing with animals that are more intelligent and I guess charismatic, a lot of times there are toys or items or enrichment devices, something like that they like, that they show that they are more attracted to, and a lot of times those things go with them so that there's something familiar when they get there. They've already got this thing that they like, some kind of enrichment like a ball or something like that, and some kind of thing that they already like. If they've shown that they really enjoy that, the zoo or aquarium is probably going to send that along with them to their new home, just so that they have that familiarity, like everything's okay. You have your toy that you really like, your enrichment item that you really like, everything's going to be fine. And that's comforting a little bit to the animals. Like not everything is crazy new because they're entering a new space, possibly in a new area of the country, perhaps in another country, who knows. And there's all these new smells, there's all these new people, lots of new noises, I'm sure. It's all very stressful for the animal, even as much as we try to prepare them for that. But at least they have, this blanket that they like, or this enrichment device that they really like from their older facility, that their former facility now is in their new facility. It's just like one little piece of normalcy. That's something that they're used to that tends to lower the stress levels just a little bit. So why we would transfer these animals in the beginning is because we either have produced them from the animals that we have in our collection already, and we don't necessarily want to mix up our genetics, or maybe we don't have the space, or maybe that's a valuable animal that will eventually go to another pairing for another zoo or aquarium that will kind of help us maintain that nice gene pool, gene diversity. So there's a lot of reasons that we start transferring animals around to other zoos and aquariums. And so it is surplus technically, but we don't necessarily want to keep them at our facility, and there was always a plan for that, right? So as part of our institutional collection planning, we are aware of which animals are probably going to be reproducing and which ones we'll need to find homes for in the end. And then there's animals that can surprise you. So as part of that collection planning, we do make plans for the entire life of these animals, right? So when they're young, we're going to raise them up. They're going to, go through all of their different stages of life. Hopefully they can reproduce at some point, and even as they get older, later in their lifespan, we still have plans for them, right? So they might not be on exhibit anymore. They might be, in the back just hanging out, and we have a plan for how they're going to live out their days, right? Probably in comfort in some little zoo, quote unquote, retirement home that we have set up behind the scenes somewhere, and that's fine, right? So in that planning, we're also trying to plan for their offspring, if there were ever to be any. And we're trying to plan for if we don't want them to reproduce. We want them to go through all the behaviors like normal, but there are some cases where we don't necessarily want to produce, right? So let's say hippos, for example. That's a very big animal that we have to have a very solid plan for. They're very large. They can be very dangerous. They require a lot of care, a lot of time, a lot of space, right? That's an animal that you want to make sure you're only breeding if you know what you're doing with those offspring. And so a lot of times that's a candidate, like an animal like that is a candidate for some sort of birth control. So you can let them go through and do all of their normal behaviors, but then there's some kind of birth control type situation happening to keep there from being actual reproduction going on, because we can't have tons and tons of hippos. Our facilities are not big enough for that, right? We don't have enough staff for that. And that would kind of mess up the genetic diversity of the overall population, right? So birth control is an option, and it doesn't always work. You'll be shocked to know that it doesn't always work. So we may have plans, we may have put some sort of birth control option into play, and the animals still get around it. They might, for whatever reason, and it happens in people too. There's lots of reasons that it might not work, but, we try to reduce that issue as much as we can. And sometimes that doesn't work, right? So all of a sudden we've got a baby animal we were not planning for. It is still great. We still love that. And we're still going to take care of it, even though it wasn't part of the plan. Just like for people, even though it wasn't part of the plan, we're going to do something about it, right? So we have a little baby animal, and we're going to now, even though it seems a little late in the process, we're going to do the whole life plan for this animal too, right? So that means, calling around to other zoos and aquariums, like who might be interested eventually when this animal is ready to be, taken from its parents or what have you, if it's old enough to be independent, that sort of thing, if it's stable enough, who might be interested in taking this animal. And we usually find somebody who has the ability to, has the staffing to, has the resources, or there's an option of also sending animals to sanctuaries at some point in their lives. Usually that tends to be older animals or animals that, end up being a part of facilities that close, honestly, where other zoos and aquariums couldn't step in to help out and take those animals on into their own collections. They might end up in a sanctuary, which is also great. They can live out their days. They don't have to do anything or be anything in particular. They don't have to hang out in a particular area where guests can see them necessarily. If they want to do that, they can, but they don't have to. And so a sanctuary situation might be the best option, right? So if you've got a lot of a type of animal that is perhaps not the best candidate for breeding just because of the genetic diversity issue that we're trying to maintain, it might end up in a sanctuary, which is okay, right? Depending on the type of animal and depending on what the sanctuary situation is. So that is also an option. For some animals, it might even be an option to release. Now, I would not recommend this for animals that have a lot of training and human interaction their entire lives and that sort of thing, because they might not understand what's going on, and it really might be damaging for us to just abandon them like that and leave them to their own devices, right? But for animals that don't get a whole lot of human interaction, to be all honest, that means maybe fish, reptiles, amphibians, and invertebrates, that kind of stuff. As long as it's a native animal, like we don't release animals into the wild. This is all done with agreement from our local, fish and wildlife departments and things like that in the U.S., right? we don't release anything without their okay. But if we're dealing with a native population, it's possible that releasing the offspring into the local waterways is actually a good idea. So there are programs that we have sometimes where we're actually breeding for release, right? So, if we've got an endangered fish or a turtle or something like that, it's something that we can keep on site and breed because we're trying to provide them the best opportunity to do so, right? And then any offspring that they produce, it's actually part of the plan to rehome them in the wild and just replenish some of the populations where they used to be, or where they're kind of small populations, right? So that also may be part of the plan. Even if we're not trying to produce animals specifically for breed and release, it could be an option to release to the wild. This is not something that we do very often. And again, we don't do this without the approval of the powers that be. It's more of a last resort, right? If we have just way too many, there's some animals that produce by the hundreds. I would say inverts, fish, that sort of thing, where it's really hard to manage how many offspring are being produced here, right? So in some of those cases, it's possible as a last resort, if we can't find a good home for them, we will possibly release, right? And before we do that, we try to make sure that the animals can survive on their own. And so that might mean that we're working with them to capture live food or something like that, make sure that they know what to do. We don't want to just ditch animals. So we're going to try to prepare them for whatever is ahead, right? And so that might mean that we work with them on their hunting skills or what have you, just to make sure that they're good to go, right? I've worked with a lot of sea turtle hatchlings over the years. The ones that tend to not do super well, they're last out of the nest, and more than likely they would have perished if the aquarium had not stepped in and scooped them up and raised them for a year or so, and then we release them. We bring them in with the intent of releasing them. So these are animals that probably wouldn't have survived on their own for whatever reason. They just couldn't get out of the nest, or they were having some issues right at the beginning, but we get them through it and we get them out of there, and we raise them knowing that they're going to be released. And so we keep our interaction with them pretty minimal, so they don't associate, well, at least the aim is that they don't associate humans with food or anything like that. So we just work on getting them ready to be living in the wild, right? And so towards the end of the time that they're in the zoo or aquarium, we're preparing them. We're giving them live food. We're making sure they can catch it. Like that kind of stuff. It might seem kind of barbaric, but that's nature, and we want to make sure that they're ready to go. And so far, so good. We've been able to track some turtles for a very long time, so they're still out there doing their thing, and that's great. But I just wanted to go over how we deal with surplus animals. Usually the things are planned for, right? We do our best to make sure that we have a plan if we can. Sometimes animals do crazy stuff and they get around our plan, and that's okay. We will live with it. We will make sure that whatever the future of that animal, wherever they end up going, it's going to be the best possible home that we can provide for them long term. And that's usually through partnerships with other facilities like us, other zoos and aquariums, who are eager to accept those animals into their collections and provide them great homes, great training, great resources, all that kind of stuff. So that's how we deal with surplus animals. More than likely, you're going to see them at another zoo or aquarium so that we don't have to take any animals from the wild. And it's good. It works out. If you have any questions about that or any other leadership or management things, zoo and aquarium stuff, whatever, just let me know. You can write it up in an email and send it to me at aquatazoo@gmail.com. If you're enjoying the show, and I hope that you do, don't forget to follow or subscribe on your podcast player of choice. That way you'll get all of that sweet, sweet content as soon as it releases. If you'd like to support the podcast directly, you can find me at patreon.com/aquatazoo. And if you'd like to take a vacation and you don't know where to start, I happen to be a personal vacation advisor with Magical Vacation Planner, and I would love to help you out. It does not cost you anything extra. The links are in the show notes. Okay, thanks for listening. I heart your faces. Okay, bye.